Welcome, everyone. My name is Jonathan Casa, and I'm a senior executive consultant here at CriticalArc Consulting, along with Jim Moore. And today we have a great panel of experts to discuss transparency, prevention, and compliance, the Stop Campus Hazing Act explained. And with us today, we have Peter Lake, Director of the Center for Excellence in Higher Education Law and Policy at Stetson University College of Law. And we also have Hillary Pettigrew, Senior Risk Management Counsel for United Educators. And we, as a panel, also welcome you to the conversation. We will have questions and answers that you can submit, and we'll try to get through those in real time here. If we have an overabundance, we will be sending a follow-up email and with any resources that are mentioned as well, and a link to the video for replay. And we also welcome you to please join the chat. Those who are with us today, feel free, if you would help us understand our audience, please type your name, your role, the institution or organization, association that you may be with, and we'll go over some housekeeping and jump into the topic at hand. I see there that Mr. Lyles has a raised hand. If you could put a question into the chat, if that's okay, we'll try to respond to that as soon as possible. We already see our first winner of the day would be Gabe from Western University. Thank you very much for the first message. So the description today for this event really is something that there's some very good training and the opportunities to raise awareness about this important amendment to the Clery Act. Hazing continues to be one of the most serious safety and wellness challenges on America's college campuses, despite the efforts of many schools to have hazing and what that means under control, so to speak. Well, that means a lot more than just the words or the letter of the law. There's also the spirit, and we always talk about that with the Jean Cleary Act, the spirit of the law as well, and striking that balance. So as you start to address the crisis, this is the one item we point out. Those who haven't heard us speak yet here at CriticalArc Consulting, the Cleary Act, it's the one thing that Congress at the end of last year agreed unanimously on when passing this amendment. And some may feel that it was a long time to get to that point, but we thank those advocates, the families, especially those whom their loved ones that inspired this act, and everyone who came together to reach the compromise and consensus that Congress made sure this amendment would pass. So there are the four core tenets, and we'll mention some of that as well with the guests that we have today. There's a lot to cover that could take many hours, but what we're going to try to do with our distinguished guests is to raise some unique perspectives and insights that perhaps institutions haven't considered because everyone was racing to make sure the initial compliance that they were able to, that they had those capacities and the capability. But today we'll talk about what's over the horizon, what may also be a risk currently and other blind spots, and areas that we can build upon that are already strengths to make sure we not only comply with this law, but reach the spirit of its intent. So thank you very much. And with that, we'll get into our panel discussion here. And one of the first topics that as a team, when we were preparing, it was trying to just set the baseline and understand from an incident and reporting perspective, what do we actually know about hazing patterns? Any key angles, Hillary, Peter, Jim, that you would like to mention? I know Hillary at United Educators, which is a nonprofit. If people aren't aware of them already, feel free to describe that, Hillary. But what patterns, perhaps, or insights has your team seen?
Of course. Well, one thing that I discovered in looking at a specific subset of our claims is that hazing rarely involved just sort of one thing. In almost all of our claims, there was a combination of at least two or more of the following types of behavior. The first one will surprise no one: forced or coerced alcohol consumption, physical assaults, such as beating, branding, paddling, or striking another person, sexualized or humiliating conduct. So that would include things like forced nudity, simulated sex acts, sexual taunts, or even penetration digitally or with foreign objects. And finally, extreme physical demands like sleep deprivation. So often it was a combination of those things in a single claim, but rarely just one thing.
Thank you. And Peter, is that something as well? I know, Hillary, these are claims that have been submitted. So
Yes.
right. I know you mentioned also the subset. So that's very good insights, but then there's the other side of that data too. Peter, can you give us some perspective as to what else you've seen, maybe on the practitioner side?
Sure, and I'll reinforce also what Hillary said, but yeah, I do believe that hazing is an iceberg phenomenon, that we see clearly the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot of behavior that goes undetected. And I think the big message I have is that hazing can occur anywhere in any group activity,
And
the
just to back that
organization. It
up a
is
little
not just
bit,
athletics or Greek organizations.
yes, among UE's
Yeah,
claims that I looked at, most often it happened in fraternity and sorority initiations. The second most frequent occurrence was in intercollegiate athletic teams, and that included wrestling, lacrosse, cheerleading, baseball, hockey, and swim teams. Interestingly, football was not represented in this particular group of claims. And then third most often, we saw it occurring in student clubs, including club sports and other organizations. So really, it's, no segment of campus is sort of immune to hazing allegations.
and I've noticed, Jonathan, that a lot of the stuff surfaces in entities on campus that have better detection mechanisms.
Mm.
So I think you're more likely to see a hazing incident occur at a fraternity or sorority because of the organizational structure. And I think Hillary drew attention to something that's very close to the work I do, is that we see stuff in the lesser well-organized entities like club sports. And as we're getting better at hazing detection, we're sort of picking it up in other places. But believe me, it's happening everywhere. And the other quick point I wanted to make too is that hazing almost always involves some kind of weaponization.
Yes.
So you've got alcohol is weaponized, branding, beating, other types of behavior that have a weaponization quality to it as well. And depending on how severe the weaponization is, that's where you get some of the worst outcomes, scarring, mutilation, paralysis, death, et cetera. And those claims can be very, very heavy claims.
And Jim, I'd like to ask you, based on those perspectives, and with your role in particular at the U.S. Department of Education, helping to inform Congress and even what someday might be guidance that comes out of the Department of Education. It's interesting what Hillary and Peter are mentioning. It's what all of us in the ClearArc world notice. Sometimes it's not those institutions with the highest number of reports that we need to worry about. Sometimes it's those with the least. Peter was mentioning detection. But Jim, where where do you see, based on what's already been shared, those groups maybe, right? This is a completely different animal, right, in the way we think about the Clery Act. Could you explain what that means to our audience?
Yeah, I mean, one of the difficulties with hazing, and we collected hazing reports at the Department of Ed for 10 years leading up to the work on this law. And we were very fortunate to be involved with several congressional offices in helping to craft it, along with a lot of other people. There were so many people committed to this for a very long time. And in some other training that we're going to do for folks, we'll get into the kind of messy sausage making of how the law got the way it is, which is a completely different conversation. But what we saw at the department and what we tried to inform Congress about was the need to have a rather expansive definition, because hazing shows up different ways at different kinds of institutions, different organizations within those schools, right? So I think to Peter's point and to Hillary's point, hazing can happen anywhere. Many people on this call have heard me say over the years some form of my conversations with presidents and board members would revolve around a discussion that I didn't think this could happen here. And I hear that in the hazing context as well. I have seen hazing at art schools. I have seen hazing in theater programs, right? I have seen hazing in cosmetology schools. And this raises a point when I talk about the cosmetology schools and the auto body schools. Why? Hazing is most likely to show up among the most venerated student groups on campus. There is more hazing likely to take place in those organizations where people want to be part of those organizations. This is why, for example, some of our historically Black colleges and universities have noticed a hazing problem in the band or the dance team, because some of those organizations are literally internationally known. At some of those schools, perhaps the football team isn't quite as good, right? But when you see hazing, for example, at a cosmetology school, I'll tell you where you always find it. It's in the traveling hair show team. That's where you find hazing. If it's in an auto body school, it's in the kids that go to the auto body car shows, the kids who do the tricked out cars with the big rims and the wraps and the whole thing. That's where the hazing is going to take place, right? So you look at your most venerated groups. And when you think about American higher education, over 6,000 schools participating in the Title IV program, who's operating 10,000 educational sites, that means you could have hazing in the theater department, in the music department, in an academic club, even a religious organization. I have seen it.
So,
right?
Jim, you're saying it's not about just geography when it comes down to this, right?
It absolutely is not. And that's one of the things we'll get to when we talk a little bit about the definitions that apply to the law. But one of the points is, and I've talked about this with military leaders, I had an opportunity to do some anti-hazing training with some officials at the Defense Department, including a couple of generals. And of course, the military has struggled to get hazing out of its system, right? And it's been very difficult, perhaps even harder than their work on sexual assault prevention, because it is literally inculcated into the culture, right? It has existed for generations. And there are a lot of people who will defend it quietly, right? And that just makes it more insidious and harder to get rid of. We're up against culture, custom, tradition, right? We also have to understand that in this hazing space, one of the things that we are up against is shared experience. I had an opportunity to discuss this with a small group of people who are former members of the Gangster Disciples street gang. And they said to me, the reason why we haze, and he says, what it means to us is that if you meet a member of our gang from LA or one from Missouri, they had the exact same initiation. It's something we share from minute one when we're in the gang, right? That is a lot to attack. And you think about the importance of tradition, custom, culture in the college experience generally. And we can start to see why we have these problems before we even get to, say, the neuroscience issues, which we'll talk about in a few minutes.
I'd like to maybe branch off from there, because we have quite a few topics to get through. And part of that is covering, we've got some perspective. Now, there's that intersection that hazing is at with federal frameworks. So there's Title IX, Title VI, Clery Act implications. Where does hazing intersect with these? And where might institutions be underestimating that overlap? Peter or Hillary?
I'd be glad to grab this one if that's okay, Hillary. And I'm
absolutely.
Sure you have to, but I think that we see situations that represent themselves to one intervention system on campus, and we tend to address it that way. So, for example, if it shows up in Title IX, it probably follows that pathway. And it may not be immediately apparent to people that this is Title IX and a hazing issue, or a Title VI and a hazing issue. And then other behavior that might be detected even in a residence hall could be considered something that simply a residence hall director or others would write up as a consequence, but actually could be a significant cog in a behavior pattern that's connected to hazing. And I think we have a lot of work to do to centralize our data and crunch it in a way that we're not just isolating an incident into one category, not realizing that this is connected to another pattern. And where I'm particularly nervous, Jonathan, is with hazing, you see a tremendous amount of behavior designed to keep hazing off of our radar screens, to make it seem like it's something else other than what it is. I mean, there very deliberate obfuscation goes on. And I think that hampers our systematic response because we might not necessarily detect that what we're actually looking at is a very clear hazing situation. I could give you any number of scenarios, but.
And I think we'll probably, it would be good to hear those as we move forward, because I think that'll help with some of these other topics as we begin to unfold this. And it reminds me also that there's hazing and there's misconduct, there's criminal behavior. So once again, is it that gray of an area for institutions? Is something with the Clery Act approaching this in a different way than we've seen maybe at the state level? And I know we're going to talk about the state level, but I want to remain on some of the other federal frameworks that we just mentioned, because it's just layer after layer of gray area that we're trying to get clarity about. Now, Jim, is it something that when we talk about, say, Title VI, those considerations, in your experience, how might that manifest itself?
Yeah, so that's exactly the problem that Peter is highlighting, right? That very often institutions are very much caught up in enforcing their codes of conduct. They don't necessarily attach them to these various federal and state requirements. And so schools just miss that a violation of the federal law has occurred, or something that is countable, say for statistical purposes, under federal law. Happens all the time. Sometimes schools just miss it because they're so wrapped up in dealing with the issues that have resulted from some kind of incident, right? We saw this, for example, in a very different way when HBCUs a couple of years ago were experiencing the horrible bomb threats, right? And some schools didn't realize in the response to that they had actually been the victim of a hate crime, right? That counted under the Clery Act and really required institutions to do all sorts of things to help their campus community members cope with the fact that people were making these horrible threats against them, right? So often we see that certain behaviors that people would generally recognize as inappropriate are in fact hazing, right? That's why the definition of hazing had to be as expansive as it is, right? At one point, there was talk of only dealing with physical harm. I was one of the people who said to one of the Senate office, I said, if you do that, you might as well not do the law, right?
Yep.
Psychological abuse in hazing is more common and often worse in its effects on people long term, right? You want to talk about scars. You want to talk about bruises that linger. Some of these behaviors stay with people for a very long time. And they will tell you that they feel as victimized as they might if they were the victim of some crime that we would all commonly accept as unacceptable on a campus, right? So those things may or may not fall under Title IX, Title VI, the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? Which is an area where we have not done enough work lately, mostly because it hasn't been enforced particularly vigorously in the last few years. We had a focus on Title IX for several years. It was desperately needed. Then, out of nowhere, we kind of redirected to Title VI. And how many schools were caught flat-footed in October of 2023 when they had to deal with the issues attendant to Title VI when we had the Israeli-Hamas war, right? And there were real issues on campus, and folks weren't ready to deal with them. They're not ready to deal with those issues as they show up in the hazing space either. And very often, part of the reason they're not ready is they haven't had the discussions on campus all the way up and all the way down about
That's it.
how we feel about hazing at this institution and how we're going to address it. We know that one of the things you have to do under the Stop Campus Hazing Act is have an anti-hazing policy. You know how many schools don't have a policy that means anything, doesn't give people actual notice of anything at all, because they can't agree really on how the institution wants to deal with these issues. Because once you start dealing with them, you have to deal with them across the board.
And I think we'll have some of those examples as well. And just before we shift to the next topic or the phase of this discussion, it's really a lot of this discussion, what I learned from the team in prep, we have to manage up and also make sure that at the most senior levels, there's an understanding of the oversight, not just the management. And it's that hazing can be non-criminal. And so, it's realizing just that aspect, besides the broad continuum we're discussing today. And oftentimes it might just be with public safety or a police department. And not having that type of sensitivity can create some major non-compliance issues if it's not being thought of and questions aren't being asked in that oversight role. So when we look at, I believe it was Jim who said, we didn't know that aspect of institutional blind spots and just the structural distance or dissonance even that may occur. How can we challenge assumptions about this, raising awareness, control, liability? Who is the authority? Who is the responsibility and the roles? What can we do to not be surprised? So, all right, we're warning people. What are some angles to draw out in terms of proactive structure?
Well, I'll go first. I'll go first. So if you think about the fact that you and I are constantly preaching to folks that the Clery Act is an institutional-wide obligation, right? And that's why we have to have things like Clery compliance teams. It is an act of foolishness or worse, perhaps malpractice, to try to have one person help the institution comply with the Clery Act. We've seen that fail, right? We need somebody to be the hub. We usually call that person a Clery Act coordinator, just as we need that for Title IX. But you need people assisting you who have different expertise. But it is usually the case that the Clery Act coordinator is going to sit in some office, often the public safety office. That's not the best place for them, but it's better than some others that we've seen, right? Or they sit in, say, the compliance office. They are not going to have detailed knowledge about everything that happens in student housing or HR, student conduct, student orgs, risk management, general counsel. We can keep going, right? These are all offices that should be represented on that Clery compliance team. And I would say, because hazing is different, you probably need another group of people who are going to come together and say, where does hazing exist in this institution? Because remember, this law requires you to dive deeper. In the Clery Act, up until now, what have we talked about? Recognized student organizations. Now we have student organizations, whether they're recognized or not. Do you know how many schools have been caught flat-footed when they find out that they have some club or organization that a lot of people would lose their minds on the board or the C-suite or the parent group if they knew that such a thing existed in the first place?
Yeah.
At the department, I had colleges, you'll forgive this if it hurts anybody's sensibilities. I had schools that had swingers clubs, BDSM clubs, all sorts of drug clubs, groups that espoused all kinds of racist ideology. Yep. Were they always recognized by the institution? No, but they're there, and a lot of them haze. And so if you get that complaint, can you imagine some college presidents getting a complaint that there was some kind of inappropriate hazing conduct going on inside some secret organization? And in the upcoming event that we're going to do, we're going to dive into the real deep dive into some of those groups. But I have schools that have essentially student chapters of outlaw motorcycle gangs on campus. That's a real thing, right? And in one case, the president of a school called me and they said, "You're not going to believe this." I said, "I probably will," right?
Oh,
And he
that's why
went
you
on
did.
to explain that he has a motorcycle gang on his campus. And he was like, I don't know how to explain this to the board. And I said, I'll help you. Right. But you're going to have to go look for these things. That's the only way you're
That's
going to
it.
root it out. You need to
So
know what goes on. And if you can't have this thing, last point, we have had many cases, many of them documented in final investigative reports at the department, of situations where some group on campus was special rules for special talents, sacred cow, right? Where like
yeah,
the president of the university wasn't allowed in the football operations building, wasn't allowed in the ROTC or Corps of Cadets building. I say that's unacceptable. You need to go find out what's going on in there. That's where you're going to find these kinds of issues or worse, right?
I like, and I believe at this group when we were having that pre-session, someone had said, "Well, that president says we never knew we had it," and the response is, "You never looked." So,
You know,
Hillary, I know at UE, especially if anyone hasn't looked at the large loss reports, K-12 as well as higher ed, United Educators is a really good resource, just like Peter and Stetson University. But in reviewing this data, Hillary, I know you've pointed out to us, and I know this has been coming up a bit, but if you could expand, it does go beyond Greek life. We have to think about hazing differently, right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of that, Jonathan?
Just that we have to think about hazing differently about where these incidents occur. It may not be the routine. And I think part of this, and we're United Educators, what I've learned from you over the years, it's about understanding that whole enterprise risk approach. And I know there are lessons to draw from that as well. But any thoughts that you have or insights in terms of the leadership and oversight scenarios
Yes,
that they should
definitely.
consider?
One of the things uh, Jim mentioned, for example, um, you know, not looking, not asking. And that was one of the major weaknesses I think I saw as a trend. And that's, I think, a large part of the genesis for the Stop Campus Hazing Act was that um, officials and high level administrators not only did they believe, well, it couldn't happen here, but the the symptoms of not looking really were grounded in, for example, treating something, and I think either Jim or Peter mentioned this, as sort of a narrow conduct violation. So there was a violation of our um, policy against alcohol or alcohol abuse or some other type of conduct violation, and not looking at sort of patterns and for the same group or same organization or even the same students potentially. So I would say it's important to maybe cast a wider net if you get sort of complaints like that, and not even look just at formal complaints, but very often there will be rumors, anonymous reports, things like that in the past. And so I think you need to follow those to their logical conclusion as well. But I think sort of being willfully blind to these things, that is not that it was a weakness before, and now I think it's truly an exposure risk for many institutions.
I like how you talk about patterns, and with that exposure risk, it's the same DNA of failure in other areas in Cleary and Risk, right? And Peter, you're usually on the other side of that, or at least you have some insights, because it sometimes isn't until that lawsuit that an institution may not even know about their hazing incident, correct?
Jim certainly knows this, but I've worked 30 long years trying to move people from a reactive to a preventative mode to get in front of things before they go wrong. And just let me say one thing to every senior leader on a board or a president out there. Hazing is an actuarial certainty over a period of time. It's not, can it happen? It will happen. And in fact, it is happening. And I just want to say that for management, sometimes what they respond to is when they hear things that I'm about to say right now, that this is an enrollment management issue. You're losing students over this. They're experiencing things and they're not going to the hospital. They're not going to the police, but they're transferring to another school or dropping out of college entirely. And it's also a major property damage issue as well. And here's a story that you're going to love, and I can't share too many details. It's an incident that I interpreted at the time as hazing. We'll just say that. But there was a building, and it had just been brand new put into service as a residence hall. 6 months. They had to replace all the plumbing. And the plumber came in and said the only way that this could happen is that people were literally vomiting 24/7 every day into the pipes. They've literally destroyed it through this. And when looking underneath that property damage claim, which was catastrophic, he realized how expensive it is to replace plumbing in a multi-story building. They realized that there was a pattern of hazing and bullying going on. And you had this significant property damage claim that comes out, and add that to the risk of fire or other significant property damage, and you realize that there's much more to this than just, oh my gosh, we could be on the front page of the newspaper. We're losing students, and we're literally having our facilities potentially put at risk by some of this behavior as well.
That is,
Wow.
And I'll just jump in there with another point. A large number of these hazing claims, as soon as the press gets hold of them, the negative publicity begins, and that can last months or even years, depending on how the institution responds to it. And putting on my insurance company lawyer hat, reputational damage is not insurable. So you're going to have a lot of costs there, and it lingers, and then sort of it's almost like a circular firing squad in a way, because that is also going to have an effect, I think, on your enrollment next year and the year after that, very likely, because parents will be, I'm not comfortable with my student going to this school.
wow.
So it can have
It's what
longer lasting effects than you might even think.
It absolutely can. I'll just add this, Jonathan. When I was at the department, one of the conversation points inside the agency for years is the fact that we have too much capacity in American higher education. There's too many seats in schools following too few students. We have a system that was built for the baby boom and the Montgomery GI Bill, right?
Yep.
And so there is extra incentive sometimes to not shine the bright light on the bad things that are happening, but that just raises the likelihood that they will leak out as scandal, right?
Wow.
And that's where you get all of these other things. So I think that Peter and Hillary, who we're so thankful have joined us today, because their insights are invaluable, truly. I hope all of you who are listening to them. But these factors have been affecting schools in profound ways. Some of these schools are going to go away. We're going to have fewer colleges a year from now than we have now. 5-10 years out, we will have a lot fewer colleges. And I can tell you that it is a buyer's market, and there are more and more parents who are calling the agency saying, I'm really worried about this thing I'm hearing about at this or that school. Now, we couldn't tell people, go to that school, don't go to this one, but we could say, you're going to want to ask the following questions, right? You might want to ask some really hard questions of various groups on campus and look into this before you decide where to send your most important possession in life, right? And I will say this too, to Peter's point, there's a lot of Jim Moore-isms. One of them is criminology is just math. These things will happen. If you really believe as an institution that you've gone the last decade without any hazing incidents, and you have a school of any size at all, any kind of student organizational structure, you're missing it. It's there. You're just not finding it yet. And you are probably on the path to a problem, right? And so from this entire concept that we've been talking about at CriticalArc Global Consulting is focusing on the idea of enterprise risk management, right? This is not a public safety issue. This is an institutional issue that goes to the very core of who the institution, what it wants to be, right? And how it wants to operate, how it wants to serve the needs of its people, how it wants to be seen by the outside world. All of those things matter, right? And all of this is just one giant knot of risk, like most other things in American higher education, right?
Right.
I often point out, Hillary will appreciate this, that I've talked to a number of underwriters over the years. I have a lot of insurance people in my family. They're very boring people, most of them. They're not like Hillary. That's why they never get invited to cocktail parties, right? But in some cases, I have had underwriters say to me, we would rather at our company insure fireworks operations in adult nightclubs than colleges. Colleges are as risky a business as there are. Our friend Doug Fearberg loves to talk about this, right? About where it ranks as a risk for insurability, right? So you really need to think about the tenets of this law, right? And I know Jonathan will pause to have me go over them at some point because we do have to highlight the 4 pillars of the law. But just think about this as a risk management issue, an enrollment management issue, a legal liability issue, and most importantly, a student wellness issue.
And Hillary, that's where the enterprise risk management, I've known you for over a decade, and really where I started to learn about how, right, what United Educators is trying to do, not just to protect assets, but lives. And any other insights just about that systemic type of approach or lack thereof?
Well, it's interesting because I took a look at steps institutions took to limit their exposure and the institutions that tended to have more increased exposure. And a couple of the things I noticed were the schools that successfully limited their exposure typically imposed things like immediate interim suspensions, removals from campus, without or no contact orders, without waiting for an investigation, putting student safety first. And so that was really the impetus behind that. They also often retained external investigators, especially for serious allegations. And I think this goes probably most to the ERM point. They were very careful to coordinate different departments or offices in the investigation and the response, including as appropriate, student conduct, campus police or public safety, the Title IX office, and legal and risk management functions, taking a more holistic approach to the problem.
Wow.
In addition, and this is something, it's sort of a pet peeve of mine. I've been at United Educators for 25 years now. I started in the claims department before moving to risk management. They were better at doing consistent and thorough documentation, because that's another place we've seen major weaknesses in these claims. For example, if you have something with an athletic team, and perhaps the coach is like, I'll handle this myself, and they handle it informally, they talk to the alleged perpetrator. There's no documentation. So later, when the victim and his parents often, or her parents, gets a lawyer, there's no record of what was done. So that's, a typical weakness in some of these claims. And then just to give you a few ideas of some of the things that tended to increase exposure, institutions who immediately created an impression of being defensive or dismissive of the harm or damage that one of their students suffered from hazing. In several matters, we saw institutions immediately characterize the allegations as drama or unsubstantiated. Well, there's been no investigation yet, so how do you know that? And they often delayed any kind of initial action, waiting for further information. There was usually nothing done, no restrictions put on the continued operation of the team or the group or organization. And finally, those institutions that had increased exposure tended to issue, vague, poorly explained sanctions, or ones that weren't consistent. Again, consistency is an important thing here, with sanctions imposed in similar matters. So there's, I think, a lack of a holistic institution-wide approach that can either, in these cases, probably increase liability exposure.
That's very interesting. And it probably reminds many of us, all right, there's certain indicators, such as if Title IX and maybe your ClearArc coordinator aren't really coordinated in handing off information and understanding what the law actually mandates. If you have a CSA problem, you're probably not going to do much better when it comes down to hazing and span of control. And with the time we have left, and we purposely have some of the core tenets towards the end. So we want to focus on oversight and wrapping our minds around more overarching goals than just checklist management that's transactional and might actually increase exposure. But I'd like to put out to the group, and this is just a natural transition. Institutions, all right, I'm president or cabinet, we'll just have a zero tolerance policy fixed. How's that work?
So you and I have talked about this many times. So one of the requirements of the law is to have an anti-hazing policy. Now, Congress wanted to have a much more sophisticated approach to this, but they ran out of time, as they often do. So what did they say? They said you can simply publish the anti-hazing policy that you already have if you have one. And at the time of passage, 44 states had some form of an anti-hazing initiative. Of course, some of them were as meager as if somebody is convicted of a crime during an act of hazing, you have to disclose it. Other states had actually had rather sophisticated laws, right? So here's one of the problems. If you just publish the policy you already had, if you look at the requirements of this law, there's quite a lot of things that you have to do. And guess what? It's not going to fit into the policy that you had. Right, so you're actually creating the next trap to the point that Peter and Hillary are talking about, right? Hillary just talked about the fact that a lot of schools who are well-intentioned might want to do these things well, but in fact, what they're putting in policy and procedure is working against them, right? Yep. So, for example, you mentioned the idea of zero tolerance. Zero tolerance often appeals to presidents of universities or board members, board committees, right? And they just say, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's have zero tolerance for hazing. And then what happens? It turns out that the rugby club is hazing its members. And the school decides to take a stand, which costs them no money, right? Because rugby isn't really making any money for them. It's a club sport. They cancel the rugby season. All 8 people who go to rugby scrums are crushed, right? Then 3 months later, you have the exact same situation in your Division I football team. And what do they say? We're going to make the starters who are hazing people, we're going to be really tough on them. We're going to make them sit out the first quarter of the first game, right? Because that's what coach decided. We're going to leave it to coach when they're playing some tomato can that they're going to beat 70-7 anyway. That will not work. That's one of the things that the department is going to look for. I can just tell you, I already know they're going to look for the discrepancy in the policy, right? The government always does that. It's like, we can't tell you exactly what your policy should be. You have to formulate one between the parameters established by the law, but we're going to make you follow it. I can tell you, we wrote people up for that for 25 years at the department, right? And so schools are already getting it wrong because they're not ready to enforce a zero tolerance policy.
Yep. And part of that's the thinking ahead. A lot of what you're describing is what Hillary was mentioning from her perspective as they look at this. And Peter, I'd like to hear from you, and then we could get to those brief overview of the 4 core principles, and then we get some closing thoughts. If there are any questions that you have, feel free to enter them in the Q&A or the chat. And if we don't answer them, we'll get back to you. There will be a follow-up email with the link and answers to questions we did not get to. But Peter, what I'm wondering, back on track, there's the behavioral realities that you discuss and what you've experienced through the legal lens of what it means, right? So we talked zero tolerance. We know this is great to have the law, but what does it mean for behaviors? And in reality, it doesn't mean all of a sudden more is going to surface. Any insights about that for institutions to have a better sensitivity to where this might be going, which is underground?
Yeah, Jonathan, the one thing I've noticed is that people who haze and are victims of hazing who often then become hazers down the road is that they have a certain drug resistance to enforcement or consequences that might come from external sources, that they'll continue to do the behavior even knowing that there are serious consequences legally and otherwise that may occur. And this has been one of the reasons I've been a little concerned about zero tolerance policies, because what I've actually seen happen is you shut down a chapter of something or an activity, and those people move next door to the campus and they continue exactly the same behavior, and often even worse than before because they're now impaneled with some victimization idea that gives them the right to continue this behavior even more. So simply deflecting the problem outside the campus or trying to eliminate it in something that we own or operate doesn't necessarily end it. Sometimes it actually makes it worse. And then I've observed something too, Jonathan, that we talked about. I know in our prep calls we brought this up, that hazing, unlike bullying, seems to be very connected to prefrontal cortex development. I notice that it kicks up in the teens and then the early 20s, and then you don't see a lot of hazing after like 28 or 30, but you see a whole bunch of it in that middle period. And I'm beginning to think we're approaching this thinking of it more of a fault and punishment mentality, almost the way we used to think of alcohol prevention, like a moral blame or a fault, when in fact what we're probably dealing with is some kind of developmental issue that's a disease that's endemic to a handful of people. Most students don't engage in hazing, but the ones who do tend to be persistent with it and very drug resistant. And I think that's been the frustration I've had in my career, is the more we throw at this, the more it keeps coming back. It's like planting bamboo. It's just, once it's there, it's hard to get rid of.
That is a great setup, and why we have Jim now going over what the law actually requires. Because we should keep in mind what Peter just said, and Hillary and Jim, and how we frame this and think about it. So let's go to where most people start, and now hear that brief overview of the four core areas. Jim, please.
Yeah, we're going to go very quickly here, but I don't want the point that our guests just made to be lost. This is extremely key. All of the researchers will tell you there is a neuroscience element to this, right? And it's very deeply rooted in the way people under 30, especially under 25, ascertain danger, right? It's all tied up in these other factors. And it's also tied up in this follow the leader mentality that tends to form in these groups, right? If you want to see an example of hazing that's based on a true story that's not in the higher ed context, watch A Few Good Men and see what happens. This follow the leader. There's a social psychology element to this too. It's terrifying what can happen, right? And if you have been tracking other things happening in the higher ed space, like the radicalization of college students online, right, and the behaviors they'll engage in that they would have never engaged in before, but especially when they get in a group, right? I have some colleagues who are working on essentially the criminology of flash mobs. It's fascinating. You get a bunch of kids, 10, 12, 15 years old, who would never be inclined to engage in serious criminal behavior, but they get together, right? And it almost becomes a bonding experience to go engage in very aberrant behavior. It's fascinating. And so we need to be aware of that. But basically, we have force of the law, the requirement to have a policy. We talked about there is a trap in this to simply adopt the policy that you had before the Stop Campus Hazing Act. It is a trap to necessarily just move toward zero tolerance for the reasons that Peter said. I can tell you that somebody who allows me to talk about this very graciously, Eric Barron, the former president of Penn State University, who took on problematic fraternities and other student organizations at the school that had the biggest Greek system in the United States, closed, I believe, 16 fraternities. He said to me and my colleague, Don Tannum at the department, he said, now I have to deal with the fact that they are unregulated, right? I can decolonize the fraternities. I have that power. I can't control what they do once I do it, right? And essentially, sometimes they still own houses, right? They're still operating essentially as the organization, except now there are no guardrails. So you need to really think about what you're going to do if you go down that path of zero tolerance. But that's the policy requirement. There is a requirement to have hazing prevention and education programming. There are several pillars of it, but here's the one that I can tell you the department has made clear that it is going to enforce. And it goes exactly to the themes we've been talking about in the last hour. Strategies for building group cohesion without hazing. That is what the department is going to want to see most of all. It's not enough for you to simply say, we prohibit all forms of hazing here. Because we know it exists in organizations, there's an expectation that you will have some kind of educational element to say to these groups, we want you to build cohesion. This is a good thing for you to get together around interest areas or whatever it is, but we are not going to tolerate hazing as being part of how you build that cohesion in the group. So then we have hazing statistics, right? Schools are going to have to compile and disclose hazing statistics in very much the way you do for other Clery crimes, except that you're going to have a little bit more expansive view, especially around this issue of recognized and unrecognized student organizations, right? And if you look at the definition of what a student organization under this law is, it includes things that a lot of schools never considered to be student organizations. A lot of schools will tell you, we never thought of the band as a student org, right? There's a lot of kids who are studying music at the school who actually get academic credit for being in the band. It is their program, right?
Yep.
The football team at a lot of schools, I've had presidents say this to me. They say, we never considered the football team a student organization. I said, well, it's full of theoretical students, student athletes, theoretically, right? It's part of the title. But they never thought of it that way. They thought of student organization as the fraternity or the chess club, right? You're going to have to think much more expansively about that, right? And you're going to have to think about what the criteria is. Initiation, continued membership, right? And affiliation. The first two are easy. Affiliation gets hard,
Yep.
right? If you're really familiar with Greek life, you'll know that a lot of fraternities and sororities have associate members. They're very similar to what we see in outlaw motorcycle gangs. There's these guys called hang-arounds. They're not full patch members, but they're affiliated with the group. Affiliation is sometimes hard to define. You better make it part of your policy if you're going to enforce it, or you're going to have all kinds of problems. Okay?
It's so much more than just the rules we see written down as for, right? It's more than
absolutely. I mean, affiliation, right? And then we have a very expansive list of various kinds of behaviors that are prohibited under that definition. And again, we'll be having another opportunity for people to learn more about that. And then there is the piece of the law that came from the other proposal. Most people remember there was something called the REACH Act out there. That was the one mostly advanced by families. There was a bit of a focus on athletics and Greek life there, primarily. Then there was this proposal that was put out there by Arnold and Porter, sometimes referred to as Frat Pack, right? Called End All Hazing. And they said, if we're going to address hazing, let's end all hazing. And one of the pieces of their proposal was something called the Hazing Transparency Report, right? And here the emphasis is a little different. Statistics are about what? Incidents of crimes reported. That's the Clery standard. Reports, just like for uniform crime reporting and NIBRs and all of that stuff, right? So when you hear that there are 22 burglaries every hour in the United States, that's coming from NIBR's data, right? That people are reporting to the police. The transparency report is about reported incidents that are investigated with a finding of responsibility under the school's codes of conduct. Okay? And there's a whole lot more for us to talk about with that, but that's the four basic tenets: policy, prevention and education, statistics, both in the annual security report and in the reporting to the department through the annual crime data collection and survey, and then the campus hazing transparency report, which needs to live on the institution's website every 6 months it needs to be updated,
And
right? And here's
that-
one last piece of advice about the transparency report, people. Technically, you don't have to post your first one until you have a case with a finding of responsibility. If I went through the 6-month period with no cases, I would say no cases of this type were reported. The government's going to go looking for these transparency reports. People are going to go looking for them, and when they don't see them, they will file complaints with the government. Now we invite the government in to look at everything, right? So let's be a little more proactive and actually step out and say we didn't have any such cases during the most recent 6-month period.
That is great advice. And thank you for the feedback we had in the chat too. We don't have any questions, but we will be sending out a recording with this webinar. We'll go a few minutes over, but it's well worth it. Thank you for those who need to get to their next appointment. But you will get a recording of this, and we will have a white paper or executive summary that comes out. But I before closing, Hillary and Peter, one question with all we talked about. If you're advising a president or a cabinet today, a board, trustee member, what's the one thing that you would tell them, an assumption about hazing or this law that they need to unlearn?
I can go first there. In part, it harkens back to the things we talked about previously. Do not look at these things in isolation, because it's almost certainly going to be, an institution-wide problem, not just a conduct violation or something like that. And then another thing that we had discussed prior to this program was that much as I think all higher ed institutions were struck by when the huge push to enforce Title IX rolled around some years back, these problems start well before students hit college campuses. In high school at the latest, in some cases, probably earlier than that. And so I would just say, as if, administrators and presidents and boards don't have enough to worry about with complying with this act, don't forget underage students on your campus. We had several claims among the group I looked at that involved high school students who are on higher education campuses for summer camps. I think in one case it was actually run by the institution, and in another it was a third party. But in both cases, there was hazing. And in one, students were bound with duct tape, and in another, they were forced to eat dog food. So particularly in that latter case, I think that might be an example of some of the psychological trauma that Jim mentioned. So just be aware of that. And also, to the extent you do have camps or K through 12 students, minors on your campus, those may be opportunities where you could consider, see if there is some training you can apply. If it's a camp that your institution is running, that's probably easier. If it's by a third party, you could ask them, what training and prevention do you do in this area? And if they don't do any, maybe reconsider whether you really want to host that camp on your campus.
Wow. That so much more than checking a box on the list. Peter, your closing thought and advice to mic drop with a president or a trustee member.
Well, and here it comes in my usual edge apocalypse kind of way. I'm detecting a potential serious compliance gap. I think that a lot of institutions are focused on Title VI compliance, Title IX compliance. They're interested in what's happening in accreditation, the various mandates coming from Ed, Justice, et cetera. And this is getting back burner attention, but it needs front burner focus from top leadership to make sure that the people and resources are in place to perform the necessary work. Right down to exactly what Jim said is if you have no incidents, someone's got to report that. Be transparent about nothing, not just something. And that message could be a $50,000 mistake, essentially, to paraphrase slightly. And then I think I would tell a story to boards and presidents if they'd hear me based on my last visit to Pearl Harbor. And it turns out the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a service person on the North Shore of Oahu with radar, and he saw the Japanese plane attack coming into Pearl. He radioed it in, and the admirals and the leadership thought They didn't trust radar. They didn't trust the radar operator. They thought it was a flock of birds, and they didn't call to general quarters. And what's the message in that? Enterprise risk management. Get systems in place that are reliable, that you can trust, that can get data from the front line to the senior leadership, so they're not responding in surprise, but they're actually able to act and to prevent and then intervene with serious incidents. And that image has haunted me since I visited Pearl last, that, as many as 1,000 servicemen may have died simply because information didn't transfer properly from someone who had it to the people who made decisions. I think this is back to Hillary's point earlier, and I think Jim's been basically saying the same thing too.
Thank you. It's a solemn reminder, but we are dealing with lives and healing and justice, and that helps to tie it all together. It's one of the reasons why, right, you don't just put this on the ClearArc coordinator or one department. And so there's an opportunity to build a proactive, holistic, institution-wide apparatus, really, that's going to help in a number of ways. Because, right, if we're having a deficiency in any one of these areas that we're talking about for regulations, we're probably going to have failures in others. So thank you for bringing that point up. On behalf of this panel, thank you very much, Jim, Peter, Hillary. We're going to share their emails and links to their organizations in our follow-up. And thank you, Kelsey, for your help today on the CriticalArc side of this team. On behalf of Jason Goodrich, our Global Director of Consulting, my good colleague as well, Jim Moore, and just the whole CriticalArc team and the CriticalArc Safe Zone team. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having another discussion with you in the near future. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you,
We appreciate it.
Thanks for the work you do.